As we get to know one another as pastor and congregation, what you're going to find out is that I am at a stage in my life where my children are a massive part of my world. And what that means is that most of my sermon illustrations are going to be stories about my children or stories about Disney movies. And so on that note, I'd like to talk for just a second about Cars 3. Now, if you're not familiar with the whole Cars universe, the way this movie works is basically it's a world where all the characters are cars, right? And the windshields are their eyes, and they have little mouths on the grill. And in the first movie, it's all about this rookie race car. His name is Lightning McQueen, and he's the best at his game, but he's incredibly arrogant and self-obsessed. And he's on the way to the big race, and he gets sidetracked into this small town off the beaten path. And he gets to know those people, and over the course of the film, has a change of heart. And he even meets a new mentor, a guy named Doc Hudson. Now, Doc is this cranky old man car in this small town. And they find out in the movie that actually he once was a great race car back in the day. He was the fabulous Hudson Hornet. And then he was in a terrible accident. And the racing world moved on without him. And so he became cranky and isolated and closed off. And so Lightning and Doc end up with a friendship. And they actually teach each other how to grow. Now we jump to the third movie in Cars 3, and Doc Hudson is now passed on, and Lightning McQueen is the old guy on the track. There's all these young rookies coming in, and he keeps getting beat, and so he's having a crisis of identity. Who am I if I am not the greatest race car on the track? And so he does a little soul searching. And he goes off to find Doc Hudson's old friends. And he sits down and he meets with them in like this backwater saloon-style country place. And they're all these old people at the back table, and they're shooting the breeze and telling old stories of the glory days gone by. And Lightning McQueen starts talking to Doc's old buddy, an old pickup truck named Smokey. And he says, I don't want what happened to Doc to happen to me. And Smokey, the old cranky old pickup truck, he kind of squints at him and he's like, well, what did happen to Doc? And Lightning McQueen says, well, racing was the best part of his life, and after the accident, well, you and I both know he was never the same again. And Smokey looks at him and he goes, is that what you think? And this is the quote I want you to hear. You're right about that first part. The crash broke Hud's body, and the no more racing broke his heart. Son of a gun didn't talk to me for 50 years. But then one day the letters started coming in, and every last one of them was about you. Hud loved racing, but coaching you, I've never seen the old grump so happy. Racing was not the best part of Hud's life. You were. I gotta say, I don't love everything that Disney puts out, but Cars 1 and Cars 3 are strangely profound for a kid's movie. Now, as most of you know, we are in the middle of our Chronological Bible series where we're reading through the entire Bible in a year, and we're all the way up to the book of Samuel, and that seems as good a place as any to get started. Now, we open up in chapter 3, and Samuel is just this kid serving in the temple with a priest named Eli. And it says, one night, Eli, who was almost blind by now, had gone to bed, and the lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was sleeping in the tabernacle near the ark of God. And suddenly the Lord called out, Samuel. Yes, Samuel replied, what is it? And he got up and ran to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? I didn't call you, Eli replied. Go back to bed. And so he did. Now, as a parent of young children who sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and try to wake me up, I gotta give Eli some credit, some kudos for not snapping at the kid. Go back to bed. God, why did you wake me up? And so then they read the next verse. In verse 6, it says, then the Lord called out again, Samuel. And again, Samuel got up and went to Eli. Here I am. Did you call me? I didn't call you, my son. Eli said, go back to bed. Now, at this point, it almost feels like God is playing a practical joke on Samuel and Eli, right? Like he's like, Samuel, and then he like hides behind the covers, right? Have you ever seen, this is right up there with that classic whipped cream feather prank. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where somebody falls asleep in their chair or on the couch or something, and you sneak up on them and you put some whipped cream in their hand, and then you take a feather and tickle their face, so when they go to itch, they smack themselves and cream themselves right in the face with whipped cream. That's the vibe I'm getting from this moment, where God is calling, and he's causing confusion for people who are just trying to sleep. But here's the beautiful part. It's not a prank. It's the quiet persistence of God who will make his voice known to his people. He calls out again in verse 8. He says, so the Lord called a third time, and once more Samuel got up and went to Eli. Here I am, did you call me? And then Eli realized it was the Lord who was calling the boy. And so he said to Samuel, go and lie down again. And if someone calls again, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. So Samuel went back to bed. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Now, this is an incredibly famous story. How many of you have heard this story before? We know that, yeah, we're pretty familiar with this story. It's they call it the call of Samuel. And most of the time, people use it to illustrate God's call on our lives. We read this passage, and then I'm supposed to ask you, okay, what is God's call on your life? What is God asking you to do? Are you listening for God's voice? And then we all go home and, I don't know, try to listen better while we're sleeping or something, you know? But this past week, I had a different question burning in my heart. I don't want to know if God is calling you. I already know he is. Every single person in this room has a call from God on our heart. What I want to know is, what are you going to do with it? When God speaks into your life, what do you do with that call? How do you respond? Okay, the call is not a big deal. Your response is. I mean, for example, imagine the next morning, Samuel wakes up and he's sitting at the breakfast table. And then Eli comes in and says, well, how did it go? What happened? And Samuel says, oh my gosh, it was so much fun. God really spoke to me. He really spoke to me. It made me feel really special. And Eli sits at the breakfast table and takes a long drag on his coffee. And, right? And what are you going to do with that? What? Do you see what I'm trying to say? The God speaking part is not the finish line. It's just the beginning. It's like when you're yelling at your teenager, pick up your clothes. Did you pick up your clothes off the floor? And they yell back, I heard you. I don't care if my voice went into your ears. I care if the clothes got off the floor. Right? Like, I heard you. I know you heard me. Dude, what did you do with what I said? God speaking is not the finish line. It's just the beginning. Or let's relate it to the church calendar, right? Today is the Sunday after Easter, right? Like, let's imagine Jesus. Jesus rises from the dead. He appears to the disciples, and then eventually he goes back into heaven. Can you imagine if the disciples looked at one another and said, well, that was really cool. We know that Jesus rose from the dead. How nice for us. Why don't we just go hang out in a room and just us, who know about Jesus. Let's sing some songs about how nice it is that Jesus rose from the dead, and I want a really comfy chair, right? And I think we should have really pretty windows because that's nice for us. I know I'm being ridiculous, but what I'm trying to show you is that sometimes in our lives, we are the ones who are being ridiculous. We cross the halfway point and we think we've scored a touchdown. The resurrection that we celebrated last week is not the end of the story. It's only the beginning. The disciples' job was not to be disciples. Just, oh, look, we're disciples. No, it was to go and make disciples. Our job is not to be disciples. It's to make, where we just sit together in this place and we're just so happy that at least we know that Jesus rose from the dead. No, our job is to make disciples. It's an important mental shift. We don't want to just be disciples. We want to be disciple-making disciples. Samuel's job was not just to hear God speaking, but to listen and obey. You see, when we forget where the finish line is, when we stop just at hearing God's voice, we stop just at being disciples instead of making disciples, we end up making our life all about us. We make our faith about our personal preferences. And I know it sounds weird, but if you're going to be a Christian, your life is no longer about you. When you make your faith all about yourself, you fail to finish strong. Most of us, we know the story of the call of Samuel. Sleeping kid, woken up multiple times. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. But off the tip of your head, can anybody tell me what God was calling Samuel to do? And the pastors need to shh, okay? Anybody remember? Most people don't know the next verse. We just take this blanket call as God is calling me. The next verse, verse 11, it says, then the Lord said to Samuel, I'm about to do a shocking thing in Israel. I'm going to carry out my threats against Eli and his family from beginning to end. I have warned him that judgment is coming upon his family forever because his sons are blaspheming God and he hasn't disciplined them. I'm going to do a shocking thing. I'm going to punish Eli. I bet that made breakfast really awkward. Right? What did God call you to do? Oh, he said, we're going to punish you for not taking care of your children. Eli was a priest in the temple who had settled on making his life about himself. He did not raise his children. He didn't care about the next generation. His sons were wicked men who did terrible things. When you make your faith all about yourself, when you neglect the next generation, you might start off awesome with this great story, but you will fail to finish strong. And that idea that someone can start out strong and then focus on themselves too much and then fail to successfully invest in the next generation, that is actually the rhythm of the book of Samuel. We see it over and over in the text. This book is full of great starts. People who start out doing so well and then they trip before they get to the finish line. And perhaps there is no greater example than the one and only King Saul. Do you remember King Saul, right? For those who don't know the story, Israel's coming out of the time of Judges, and it was chaotic, and the people of Israel, you get to chapter 8, and it basically goes like this. Israel says, we want a king. And Samuel warns them, he's like, no, you don't want a king. Kings are terrible, right? They're going to go corrupt. They're going to take all your stuff. They're going to control your lives. You do not want a king. And Israel says, no, we do. Those people over there have a king, so we want a king. And so God raises up a man named Saul. And Saul has such an epic beginning. He's head and shoulders taller than anyone else. He's this amazing warrior. Everyone is so excited about King Saul. In chapter 11, he beats the Ammonites. In chapter 13, he goes to war with Philistia. In chapter 14, verse 47, this kind of sums it up. He says, now when Saul had secured his grasp on Israel's throne, he fought against his enemies in every direction, against Moab, Ammon, Edom, the kings of Zobah, the Philistines, and wherever he turned, he was victorious. He performed great deeds and conquered the Amalekites, saving Israel from all those who had plundered them. He was everything they dreamed he would be. He was this incredible king. He started off strong. He started off strong like Eli did, like Samuel did, but then he made it all about himself. When the time came for Saul to hand over the reins to the next king, you remember the story of David and Goliath, right? When it came time to hand over the kingdom, he, rather than make a smooth transition in power, Saul became jealous of David. And we're going to talk more about Saul and David next week, but he made it all about himself and he failed to finish strong. And what we learn from that, and what we see in the text is that if you want to finish strong, we have to pass on what we have to other people. Finishing strong means intentional focus on legacy. You see it with Eli and Samuel. You see it with Saul and David. You see it in each of our lives. Think about your faith journey. Have you made your faith about you? Have you settled for just being a disciple instead of making disciples? One of the greatest reasons the church in America is dying is that because we have become inwardly focused. We ask the wrong question. We want to ask the question, what do people who are already in here want? Instead of asking the question, what do the people who are still out there need? Do you see how we do it? We put our wants over their needs. I think about this church. And one of the most impressive things that I have seen is the way you blend worship styles. This congregation knows their hymns. Like we can tell up here, I don't know if you realize, when we're up here, the congregation sings those hymns, right? We know our hymns. You guys love traditional music as evidenced by the volume of singing, and yet in this place, rather than focusing solely on what I want personally. You are intentionally providing music that will reach people of the younger generation who don't know Jesus yet. That's amazing. That's a very good thing, right? Finishing strong in our faith means an intentional focus on legacy, on passing what we have to others. You see, the good news this morning is that God works through you, not just in you. In the beginning, when we first come to faith, God starts working in us. When we give our lives to Jesus, there is a transformation that happens in our lives. The old self dies and we are resurrected to a new life in Christ. There is an incredible work in us, and that's awesome. But what I hope you are catching today is that is not the finish line. God's work in us is just the beginning. What we see when we talk about legacy and succession in the book of Samuel is that after he works in us, he will work through us. There's an old quote that everybody loves to pull out of Philippians. Have you heard this before? Philippians chapter 1, verse 6, it says, "And I am certain that God who began the good work within you will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns." Have we heard this before? I am sure that God who began a good work in you will complete it, right? And we put it on bumper stickers, and we put it on coffee mugs, and we put it on our walls in our homes. I am sure that he who started a good work in you will complete it. But here's the thing. There's an incredible work that God works in us. Oh, here we go. I lost my spot. Sorry. God started this work in my heart, and he's still working on me, and he won't give up on me, and he's not going to finish until he finishes this work in me. And that is true. God will complete his work in you, but that's not what it said. Read it with me again slowly. Pay attention. Verse 6, it says, "And I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns." We are talking about something so much bigger than our individual lives. We are a part of something that is going to continue to change the world until Jesus comes back. This is not just a work in our lives. This is a good work through us into the world. God works through you, not just in you. And the way we respond is to remember your faith is not about you. To finish strong, we need to intentionally focus on legacy, on reaching and sharing our faith with those who do not know Jesus. One of the things we talked about a lot in the ministry at this church is how close this campus is to the SVSU campus. We're like this far away, right? And I keep hearing people talk about there's so much potential. There's so much great potential for ministry, for college ministry. And I hear people say, and I've heard a few people say stuff like, and I heard this in my last church, and I heard it in my church before that. They say, "Oh, I can't wait to get young people to get in here. We could get them to do this, and we could get them to do this and this. We can get them to do all the things we don't want to do anymore." But that's completely backwards, isn't it? Rather than asking, how can we have these young people do what we want them to do, the question should be, how can we pour into the young people? How can we offer them the gifts that we have because God is working through us? You see, here's the thing about college ministry. It's transitional, right? If a kid comes as a college freshman, we get them for what? 4 years, maybe 5, right? Or if they come as a sophomore or junior, you get them for 1 or 2 years. The church is not a lake gathering up as many people as we can. It is a river of people flowing through our community who we are going to pour into and bless as they come. If God's going to work through us, it's a call of hospitality for every ministry. For a lot of volunteers in the church, we have this mentality of this is my ministry, and I will do it until I don't feel like doing it anymore, and then I will pass it on to someone else. But I want us to shift that mentality, shift the culture of the church. I want us to be more hospitable in our ministries. We should always be welcoming new faces and always be teaching to those around us. If your ministry stops with you, you've stopped at the wrong finishing line. We want to keep going. And let me take a moment to admit, I struggle with this too. As a pastor, it is so easy for me to say, you know what, I'll just take care of it. I'll just do it myself. Getting other people involved, it takes longer. It's more frustrating. I got to work with other people's schedules. I have to think about other people. I'll just do it myself. Have you ever thought that? Rather than invest in someone else or work together with someone, I'll just do it myself. To include others, it takes longer. It's more frustrating. But finishing strong means an intentional focus on legacy. And that means moving beyond God's work in us and getting into God's work through us. Okay, so as you may be noticing, I end all my sermons with a challenge for you. I always try to ask the question, okay, so what? What are we going to do with this? How does all this stuff about legacy and Samuel and Saul, how does that affect us today? And so I have two challenges for you coming out of the text. Number one, I want you to set your eyes on the real finish line. And by that I mean sharing God with other people. Don't stop with your personal faith journey. Your personal faith journey is so important. But that's the 50-yard line. Baptism is not the end, it's the beginning. Resurrection is not the end of the story, it's the beginning. God is working in you. That's not the end, it's the beginning. Finish strong by focusing on sharing God with others. Set your eyes on the real finish line. And I want to be very practical about this. All right, this is something that I have been learning recently. I want to encourage you all to make a list. Make a list of people in your life who do not know Jesus. And then I just want you to start praying for each person on that list every day. Pray for your list. I want us to have intentional relationships with the people around us. Love them intentionally. Ask God to share with you opportunities to share the gospel with them. Share the story of Jesus with the people around you. And I know some of you might be saying, Pastor JJ, I am not an extrovert. I am not good at sharing my faith. God's not done working in me. I'm not ready, so there's no way that God could work through me. So many of us, we assume we're not capable. I'm not ready. God, oh boy, I couldn't do that. So let me close with this story. I've told this story to some people before, and I apologize. I actually never wanted to be a pastor. I had no interest. My father is a pastor. My mom's dad is a pastor, my grandfather. He retired out of the Ames UMC just up the road. My great-grandparents were missionaries. It's a family business. So the one thing I was never going to do was become a pastor. But God's call on my life was relentless. And so I ended up in seminary, but I told myself, I am not going to be a pastor. I'm going to be a professor. I like studying this religion stuff. I like studying the Bible. I'll do the professor. Professors are cool. Pastors are lame, right? I didn't want to be a pastor. But part of my seminary education is field ministry. They put you out into the world, right? So you got to get some hands-on experience. And so a lot of us, you could become a chaplain at a hospital, or you could be a counselor in a biblical counseling session, or as a young 23-year-old kid who was recently married, youth ministry, right? So they put me in a church, and I was the youth intern for a couple of months. Now remember, I know nothing. I don't want to be a pastor. I want to be a Bible teacher. I want to be a professor. But I got to get this credit for school, so I'm in the church. And one day I get a call from a mom in the church, and she says, my son got in a fight in the locker room at school. My son plays for the basketball team, and he got into a fight. And the other boy that she was fighting with was also goes to our church. Could you sit them down and talk to them? Now, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, that sounds horrible. I have no idea what to say. I have no idea what to do. No, I don't want to do this. But of course, I said, sure. All right, I will talk to the boys. And so I cleaned my office, and I got out some Bible verses, and I had these two boys come, and I had this weird, almost out-of-body experience, because I was there talking. I have no idea what I said. I have no idea if I was elegant or anything like that, because the whole time I was talking to them, in my mind, I was on my knees begging for God's help. I was like, God, you got to help me. You got to help me talk. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm going to say. God, you got to help me. I don't know what I'm going to do. And God, just help me not mess them up, right? Just help me not ruin these children. And if I do, God, just send someone wiser to catch them in the hallway when they're leaving. Just send someone, just don't let me mess them up too bad, right? God, I just need your help. And I had this moment, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And so I put it all out there, and we talked for 20 minutes, maybe a half hour. I think we prayed, and then I took him to Steak and Shake. That was it. I spent an hour with him. It was not that big a deal, and I was convinced I failed. I knew I did a bad job, right? A week goes by, and I get a phone call from that mom again. She's in tears. I was like, oh no, what did I do? And it took me a little while to realize there were tears of happiness. And she said, I don't know what you said, and I don't know what you did, but that little, my son just invited that boy over, and they are playing basketball in my driveway right now. Thank you. And I had this moment of like, whoa. Because I know that wasn't me, right? I had nothing to do with the good that was done that day. That was all God. But he did it through me. I got to be a part of what God was doing, even though I wasn't graduated. I didn't know all this stuff. I wasn't a professional or anything. That moment was pivotal for me, and it's a big part of the why I am in front of you today. I became a pastor because of that moment. And I want to make it very clear, it was not my elegance or Bible knowledge. I was not perfect or even ready. But God worked through me to create transformation. And if he can do it with little old me, I promise he can do it with you. Imagine what God could do through all of us working together. In the Disney classic Cars, Lightning McQueen thought his mentor was never the same and he couldn't race anymore. He never realized that his happiest days were when he became a mentor and a coach to the next generation, investing in the people around you, sharing Jesus and teaching people about Jesus, moving beyond yourself, setting your eyes on the true finish line, and letting God work through you. That's how you finish strong. Amen.